Welcome back. In the previous set of lectures, we talked about CSS basics, the properties that CSS has. Now I'm going to show you a few ways to construct CSS selectors. CSS selectors can be broad or very specific. A good example would be querying a database. The amount of data that's returned is dependent on 1, the query itself and how specific it is, and 2, the amount of data in the database. CSS selectors essentially query the HTML, and the returned elements are the elements that are styled. And the last item we'll discuss is efficiency. Efficiency is critical. If you have a very large HTML page and your CSS selectors are not efficient, those inefficient CSS selectors could really slow down your web page, especially if your user is running a slower computer. Let's review a few examples. Throughout these examples, the CSS selector will be on the left and the HTML will be on the right. In the first example, we're selecting by tag. In this case, we're selecting by the P element and applying a font size property and a color property. In the HTML, there's a div container element, and within that element, there's the P tag. This one's pretty simple. All we're doing is selecting the P element. This selector would select all of the P elements within the HTML page. The HTML to the right is really simplistic, so keep that in mind. This would select every P element in the HTML. In the next example, we're selecting by ID. IDs should be unique within a page. If an element has an ID, you can use that ID as a selector to style only that element. And in this case, the ID is para, and in the HTML, there's the ID attribute equal to para. We're styling that P element and only that specific P element. In this example, we're selecting by a CSS class. In the previous example, I said that IDs should be unique in the HTML. They should only be tagged to one element, while classes can be applied to multiple elements. And we'll talk more about CSS classes in a future lecture, but for now, what you need to know is you can apply CSS classes to multiple elements and then use that CSS class as a selector. In this example, we have the green class. And as you can see in the HTML, there's the class attribute equal to green. If more elements had this class assigned to it, they would also be selected. In this example, we're pairing the P tag with the green class. You can read this left to right. Select all P elements with the green class. Other P elements in the HTML that did not have the class green would not be selected. In this example, we're down selecting using a parent container. Let's read this selector right to left. All elements that have the green class within a container that has an ID equal to content. That sounded pretty convoluted, but it's actually really simple. Looking at this HTML, we have the div which has an ID of content, and then it looks for elements that have the green class assigned to them. A useful way to use this down selecting method is if you want to style elements in the header opposed to the body or footer. That's really useful. Now let's see this demonstrated in a real web page. As we said, one way to select an element is to use the tag. Let's look at the H2 elements. Scroll down to the content here, and you'll see H2, section box 1, section box 2, and here's section box 3. Each one of them are an H2 element. In the CSS panel, we're selecting H2 elements and assigning the margin top property to them. If we wanted to, we could add another selector by the tag P. Font size is 20px. And that would select each and every P element in this web page and make it font size 20px. Another way to select elements is by the ID. Look in the CSS panel and look at hashtag content. The hashtag indicates that we're selecting by an ID, and content is the ID. Let's find that in the HTML markup. And it's right here, div class container, ID equals content. Now this ID should be unique in the web page. There should only be one element with the ID content. So when we select by an ID, we're targeting one specific element. In this case, we're assigning text-align center to this element. The elements inside of the content div will inherit that property. Now let's talk about CSS classes. Here's the TechFused class, and it's assigned to these menu items. Now using the same logic, this is selecting all items that have the TechFused class. The period indicates that it's a class selector. Well, that's certainly simple, but CSS selectors can actually get quite complex. You can use multiple selectors together to down select to certain elements that you want to style. Consider this selector, content fa. Again, the hash symbol indicates that we're selecting by ID, content is the ID value, and the period indicates that we're selecting by class, fa is the class. So what does this mean? Well, we're selecting content. Let's scroll down. Here's the content element. And then we're selecting all elements that have the fa class assigned to them, but only the ones that are underneath the content element. Here's content, and here are the fa elements underneath content. Now there are other elements with the fa class assigned to them, but they're up here underneath the navbar collapse element. If we wanted to style the fa elements underneath this ID, all we would do is copy this and right click, and boom, we're styling these elements. The elements with the fa class underneath content wouldn't be affected. In summary, we learned that CSS selectors can be broad or specific. We learned a few selectors. We learned how to select by an HTML tag. We learned how to select by an ID. We learned how to select by a class. And we also learned how to construct complex selectors. That's all for now. We'll see you in the next lecture.